Do not leave him there. If the forest wanted him dead, it would have taken him before we arrived. Eleanor Hayes called out as the cold mountain wind swept through the towering pine trees, carrying her voice across the quiet wilderness. The elderly woodcutter beside her hesitated, glancing nervously toward the unconscious stranger lying among the fallen leaves. His expensive cloak, though torn and covered with dust, hinted that he did not belong anywhere near this isolated part of the kingdom. The old man shook his head slowly. We do not know who he is. Bringing a stranger home could bring trouble. Eleanor looked at the young man once more. His breathing was steady but shallow, and although he appeared exhausted, there were no obvious signs that he had been attacked. Something about his peaceful expression made it impossible for her to walk away. She had spent the last 25 years living alone on the edge of Silver Pine Forest, helping lost travelers, injured animals, and anyone who needed kindness without expecting anything in return. Her neighbors often joked that Eleanor trusted people too easily. She always answered with the same quiet smile. Compassion is never wasted. Without another word, she knelt beside the stranger and gently adjusted the heavy cloak around his shoulders to keep him warm against the cool autumn air. Together, she and the woodcutter carefully helped him onto the small wooden cart she used for gathering herbs. The journey back to her cottage took nearly 40 minutes along narrow woodland trails lined with golden maple trees glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Birds sang peacefully overhead, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh rain through the forest. Nothing about the quiet landscape suggested that destiny itself had just changed direction. When they finally reached the modest cottage nestled beside a clear mountain stream, Eleanor carefully prepared the guest room that had remained empty for years. She lit a fire in the stone fireplace, placed warm blankets over the stranger, and brewed an herbal tea using recipes her own mother had taught her long ago. As she gently rested a cool cloth across his forehead, something unexpected happened. The unconscious man quietly whispered a single word. "Mother." Eleanor froze. She looked around the silent room, convinced she must have imagined it. The stranger remained asleep, his face calm once again as though nothing had happened. A strange ache settled deep within her heart. Decades earlier, she had given birth to a son she had been told did not survive his first night. Time had taught her to live with that unbearable loss. Yet hearing that single word awakened emotions she believed had faded forever. She slowly stood and walked toward the window, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the forest. Outside, the peaceful stream reflected the colors of the evening sky, while distant wolves howled softly across the mountains. Eleanor whispered to herself, "Who are you?" Far beyond the forest, inside the magnificent royal palace, anxious advisors searched every corridor after discovering that King Alpha Lucas Ashford had vanished during a private journey earlier that morning. No one knew where he had gone. No one knew he now rested peacefully beneath the roof of a woman whose kindness had already saved his life. And neither of them could possibly imagine that the invisible bond connecting them had existed since the very day he entered the world. Morning sunlight slowly filtered through the lace curtains of the small woodland cottage, filling the quiet room with a warm golden glow as birds greeted the new day from the towering pine trees outside. Eleanor Hayes had been awake for hours, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, and preparing a simple breakfast before quietly checking on the stranger sleeping in the guest room. To her surprise, his breathing had become stronger, and the weariness that had covered his face the night before had begun to fade. She gently placed a steaming cup of herbal tea on the bedside table just as the young man slowly opened his eyes. For several silent moments, he simply stared at the wooden ceiling above him, trying to understand where he was. The scent of fresh bread, wild herbs, and burning cedar drifted through the room, carrying a feeling of peace he had not experienced in years. Eleanor stepped inside with a kind smile. "You are finally awake." The stranger sat up carefully, still gathering his thoughts. "Where am I?" he asked in a calm but slightly confused voice. "My cottage," Eleanor replied. "I found you in the forest yesterday afternoon." He looked down at the neatly folded blanket covering him before quietly saying, "Then I owe you my thanks." Eleanor smiled gently. "You owe me nothing. Anyone would have done the same." He almost laughed at those words because he knew that was not true. Few people willingly trusted strangers, especially in the remote wilderness surrounding Silver Pine Forest. As he accepted the warm cup of tea, he noticed how carefully the room had been arranged. Every shelf held handmade pottery, dried herbs, or family keepsakes collected over many years. Nothing reflected wealth, yet everything reflected care. Eleanor placed fresh bread and homemade berry preserves on the small wooden table before inviting him to eat. He realized he was far hungrier than he had expected. While they shared breakfast, their conversation remained simple. Eleanor asked only whether he felt well enough to stand. She never questioned where he came from or why he had been alone in the forest. The stranger found that unusual. Most people would have demanded answers immediately. Instead, she treated him like an ordinary guest. "What should I call you?" Eleanor finally asked. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Lucas." He chose not to reveal anything more. Not because he wished to deceive her, but because years of responsibility had taught him that revealing his true identity too quickly often changed the way people behaved around him. Eleanor nodded warmly. "It is a good name." As Lucas looked around the cozy cottage once again, his attention stopped on an old wooden rocking chair resting beside the fireplace. Draped over its back was a carefully stitched baby blanket embroidered with tiny silver wolves beneath a crescent moon. Beside it sat a small carved wooden cradle that appeared untouched for decades. The sight stirred something deep inside him, an emotion he could not explain. A faint memory flickered through his mind. A gentle woman's voice humming a lullaby. Warm hands lifting him. The comforting scent of lavender. The images vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Eleanor noticed him looking toward the cradle and quietly lowered her eyes. "It belonged to my son," she said softly. "I kept it because letting go always felt harder than hoping." Lucas turned back toward her, feeling an unexpected heaviness settle in his heart. He did not know why her words affected him so deeply, only that for the first time in many years, the lonely silence that had quietly followed him throughout his life seemed to soften inside the warmth of a stranger's home. The peaceful rhythm of the cottage slowly settled into Lucas's heart over the next 2 days, and with every passing hour he found himself wondering how a place so small could feel more welcoming than the vast halls of the royal palace. Each morning Eleanor Hayes greeted the sunrise before anyone else, tending her herb garden beside the clear mountain stream while humming the same gentle lullaby that had echoed through Lucas's dreams since childhood. He never mentioned the strange familiarity of the melody. Instead, he quietly helped her carry baskets of fresh vegetables, repaired an old wooden fence beside the chicken coop, and gathered firewood beneath the towering pines. Eleanor smiled whenever he insisted on helping, reminding him that guests were meant to rest rather than work. Lucas simply answered that honest work had a way of clearing troubled thoughts. The answer made Eleanor laugh softly because it sounded exactly like something her own father used to say many years ago. Late that afternoon, they walked together along a narrow forest trail where wildflowers covered the hillsides beneath the warm autumn sun. Eleanor stopped beside a small stone bridge crossing the crystal-clear stream and carefully filled a woven basket with medicinal herbs growing naturally between the rocks. Lucas watched her identify every plant with remarkable confidence. She explained which leaves eased fever, which flowers calmed anxious minds, and which roots helped restore strength after long journeys. Her knowledge came not from expensive books, but from generations of quiet experience passed from one family member to another. Lucas admired the patience with which she treated every living thing, whether it was a tiny flower pushing through the stones or an injured bird resting safely in her hands. He realized she never hurried through life. She allowed every moment to become meaningful. As they returned toward the cottage, they met several villagers traveling home from the weekly market. Every person greeted Eleanor warmly, thanking her for helping deliver medicine during difficult winters or sitting beside loved ones through lonely nights. Lucas noticed that none of them praised her because she possessed wealth or influence. They respected her because she had quietly earned their trust over many years. The realization stayed with him long after the conversations ended. That evening, after supper, Eleanor opened a weathered wooden chest resting beside the fireplace. She removed several faded keepsakes, including a tiny pair of knitted baby socks, a silver rattle engraved with delicate crescent moons, and a carefully folded piece of linen embroidered with the initials E and L. Lucas looked at the objects with quiet curiosity. Eleanor gently traced the tiny stitching with her fingertips before speaking. I made these while I was waiting for my son to be born. I could never bring myself to put them away forever. Lucas listened without interrupting. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a lifetime of love that had never found its destination. He found himself asking a question he had never intended to speak aloud. If you could meet him today, after all these years, what would you say? Eleanor looked toward the dancing firelight before answering with a peaceful smile. Nothing at first. I would simply be grateful to know he had lived a good life. Those words settled deeply inside Lucas, awakening an emotion he could neither explain nor ignore. Far beyond the quiet forest, inside the royal palace, Captain Nathaniel Brooks informed the anxious royal council that every search party had returned without success. The Alpha King remained missing, and uncertainty had begun spreading throughout the kingdom. Yet only a few miles away, the man they desperately sought sat quietly beside a warm fireplace, listening to a mother speak about the son she believed she had lost forever, unaware that every answer he had spent his life searching for was already waiting beneath the same roof. Rain arrived quietly before dawn, covering Silver Pine Forest with a gentle mist that transformed every tree into a pale silhouette beneath the soft gray sky. Eleanor Hayes welcomed the cool morning with the same peaceful routine she had followed for decades, placing fresh herbs beneath the cottage porch while a kettle warmed over the stone fireplace. Lucas had slept more deeply than he had in months, and when he stepped outside carrying 2 empty wooden buckets, he noticed Eleanor smiling as though she had expected him to appear at that exact moment. "You are recovering quickly," she said warmly. Lucas returned the smile. "Perhaps your tea is stronger than palace physicians would admit." Eleanor laughed softly without understanding how close his words came to the truth. Together they walked toward the clear spring that supplied fresh water to the cottage. Along the narrow trail, sunlight slowly pierced through the morning fog, illuminating tiny drops of rain resting upon pine needles like scattered crystals. Lucas found himself studying Eleanor more carefully than before. Every movement carried quiet confidence. Every decision reflected years of experience caring for others. There was something deeply familiar about the way she paused to greet every bird, every flower, and every passing traveler, as though the world itself deserved kindness. After returning home, Eleanor began preparing fresh bread, while Lucas repaired a loose wooden shutter that had rattled through the previous night's rain. As he adjusted the old hinges, something carved into the window frame caught his attention. Hidden beneath years of weathered wood was a small symbol shaped like a crescent moon surrounded by 3 tiny stars. His expression changed almost immediately. He had seen that symbol before. It appeared in only one forgotten chapter of the oldest royal family records, representing an ancient blessing traditionally carved into the nursery of newborn heirs. Lucas gently traced the faded carving with his fingertips before asking as casually as possible, "Who built this cottage?" Eleanor looked toward the old frame and smiled thoughtfully. "It belonged to my parents before it became mine. My father carved little symbols everywhere because he believed every home should tell a story." Lucas nodded quietly, though questions had already begun filling his mind. Later that afternoon, while Eleanor searched the attic for dried lavender, she accidentally dropped a small linen pouch that had remained untouched for many years. Several old keepsakes spilled gently across the wooden floor. Lucas immediately stepped forward to help gather them. Among the simple belongings rested a beautifully crafted silver pendant unlike anything else in the cottage. The pendant displayed the same crescent moon surrounded by 3 stars, although time had worn its surface smooth. Eleanor looked at it with quiet surprise. "I almost forgot I still had that." Lucas carefully handed it back. "Where did it come from?" She slowly shook her head. "I do not know. It was wrapped inside the blanket beside my baby after he was born. I always believed it belonged to his father, but no one could ever explain its meaning." Lucas remained silent, though his heartbeat had become noticeably heavier. Too many coincidences were beginning to gather around one quiet woman living alone beside the forest. The lullaby, the cradle, the embroidered blanket, now the ancient royal symbol. None of them proved anything on their own, yet together they formed the outline of a forgotten story waiting patiently to be uncovered. That evening, far inside the royal archives, Captain Nathaniel Brooks unlocked a neglected storage chamber searching for records connected to the Alpha King's earliest years. Behind shelves untouched for decades, he discovered a sealed wooden chest marked with the identical crescent moon and 3 stars. He stared at the symbol in stunned silence, unaware that hundreds of miles away another identical emblem rested quietly inside Eleanor's hands, bringing 2 distant lives one step closer to a truth neither of them was yet prepared to hear. The discovery of the matching symbols lingered in Lucas's thoughts long after the evening fire had faded into glowing embers. Sleep came only in brief moments before unfamiliar dreams returned once again. He saw a grand stone chamber bathed in warm candlelight, heard the same gentle lullaby echoing through the room, and felt a pair of caring hands lifting him into a wooden cradle. Just before he awoke, a woman's voice whispered softly, "No matter where life carries you, my son, love will always find you." Lucas opened his eyes before sunrise, his heart beating faster than usual. The dream felt less like imagination and more like a memory waiting patiently beneath the surface. Outside, Eleanor Hayes was already gathering fresh lavender from the garden, unaware that the same morning another piece of the forgotten past was beginning to reveal itself. After breakfast, Lucas offered to accompany her to the neighboring village where she delivered herbal remedies every week. The narrow trail wound through towering pine trees before opening into a peaceful valley filled with modest homes, grazing sheep, and smiling neighbors who welcomed Eleanor with genuine affection. Everywhere she walked, people greeted her by name, thanking her for years of kindness that had quietly touched their lives. Lucas noticed that no one praised her because she possessed authority or wealth. They respected her because she had always chosen compassion, even when no one was watching. As Eleanor visited an elderly couple recovering from illness, Lucas wandered through the small village square until an old clockmaker invited him inside his workshop to escape a brief afternoon shower. The tiny shop overflowed with antique timepieces, faded family photographs, and shelves filled with forgotten heirlooms collected across generations. While waiting for the rain to pass, Lucas's attention was drawn to a framed sketch hanging on the far wall. It depicted an ancient ceremonial pendant bearing a crescent moon surrounded by 3 stars. His expression immediately changed. The elderly clockmaker noticed his curiosity and smiled. "A beautiful design, is it not? My grandfather copied that drawing more than 40 years ago after seeing the original inside the royal palace." Lucas stepped closer. "Do you know what it represented?" The old man adjusted his glasses before answering. According to family stories, only one pendant was ever created. It was crafted for the woman chosen to protect the future heir of the royal bloodline. After the prince disappeared as an infant, no one ever spoke about it again. Lucas remained silent as every word settled heavily upon his mind. The pendant resting inside Eleanor's cottage was no ordinary keepsake. It belonged to a forgotten chapter of royal history. Back at the cottage later that evening, Eleanor carefully folded fresh laundry while Lucas quietly studied the silver pendant resting upon the wooden table. She noticed the thoughtful expression on his face and smiled gently. "You have been unusually quiet today." Lucas looked toward her with calm sincerity. "Have you ever wondered if someone told you only part of the truth about your son's birth?" Eleanor paused for several long moments. Her peaceful smile slowly faded into quiet reflection. "Every mother who loses a child wonders that at least once," she answered softly. "But after enough years, you learn to stop asking questions that no one can answer." Lucas lowered his eyes toward the pendant once more. Deep inside, he no longer believed that was true. Somewhere beyond the quiet mountains, forgotten records, hidden witnesses, and long-buried promises were slowly beginning to align, and for the first time in his life, he sensed that the answers he had never thought to search for were waiting at the end of a path that had begun with one woman's simple decision to save a stranger in the forest. The following morning arrived beneath a sky of brilliant blue, yet Lucas Ashford could no longer ignore the growing feeling that fate had led him to Silver Pine Forest for a reason far greater than chance. After sharing breakfast with Eleanor Hayes, he quietly excused himself and walked alone to the highest ridge overlooking the valley. From there he could see the winding river, the tiny village beyond the trees, and the peaceful cottage where he had unexpectedly found more comfort in a few days than he had experienced during years inside the royal palace. He reached into the pocket of his traveling cloak and removed the small communication medallion he always carried during private journeys. For several long moments, he simply stared at it before finally activating the ancient silver device. Hundreds of miles away, deep inside the royal palace, Captain Nathaniel Brooks nearly dropped the stack of reports in his hands when the medallion suddenly glowed with soft blue light. "Your Majesty," he breathed with visible relief. Lucas spoke calmly. "I am safe. Cancel the wider search parties immediately." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. The council feared the worst. "We have searched every mountain pass and every northern province." Lucas looked toward Eleanor's cottage in the distance before replying. "I will return soon, but before I do, I need every document connected to my infancy, especially anything sealed under the Crescent Moon Archive." Nathaniel hesitated. "Those records have remained restricted since the reign of the late king." Lucas answered without hesitation. "Then unlock them. Personally." The connection faded, leaving Nathaniel standing in thoughtful silence. Less than an hour later, he entered the oldest archive beneath the palace where dusty shelves held forgotten histories no one had touched in decades. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing dried herbs for the coming winter, while Lucas repaired several loose stones surrounding the garden path. Watching him work, Eleanor smiled with quiet amusement. "You certainly do not behave like someone accustomed to being waited on." Lucas returned the smile. "Perhaps people become stronger when they learn to serve before expecting to be served." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Then whoever raised you taught you well." Her words lingered in the cool autumn air. Lucas looked away for a moment, uncertain how to answer. The king and queen who had raised him had loved him deeply, yet an unexpected question now echoed within him. Had another pair of loving hands once held him before destiny carried him elsewhere? As evening settled across the valley, a rider appeared on the distant forest road. He wore plain traveling clothes rather than royal colors, yet Lucas recognized him immediately. Nathaniel had come personally instead of sending another messenger. When the captain quietly approached the cottage, he respectfully greeted Eleanor before handing Lucas a weathered leather folder secured with faded wax. "These were the only records that survived," he said softly. Lucas opened the folder beneath the fading light of sunset. Inside rested an old birth record, a faded nursery inventory, and one handwritten statement from an elderly palace midwife recorded many years earlier. His eyes stopped on a single sentence that seemed to silence the entire world around him. The infant prince was entrusted to another mother's arms before sunrise to preserve the future of the royal bloodline. Lucas slowly lowered the page, his heartbeat echoing louder than the whispering wind through the pines. Only a few yards away, Eleanor quietly hummed the familiar lullaby while hanging freshly washed linen beneath the evening sky, completely unaware that the first official record had finally confirmed the impossible truth that destiny had been patiently guiding them toward since the day they unknowingly met in the forest. Lucas Ashford remained awake long after midnight, sitting alone beneath the old oak tree overlooking Eleanor Hayes's quiet cottage while the weathered leather folder rested unopened beside him. He had read the surviving records again and again, hoping each reading would somehow reveal a different conclusion, but every line only strengthened the impossible truth beginning to take shape. The infant prince had been placed into another mother's arms before sunrise. The ancient pendant, the forgotten lullaby, the nursery symbol carved into the cottage window. None of those details had meant anything by themselves. Together, they had become the first threads of a story stretching back more than 3 decades. Yet Lucas refused to accept emotion as proof. A king could not build the future of an entire kingdom upon hope alone. At dawn, Captain Nathaniel Brooks quietly approached with another sealed envelope recovered from the deepest section of the royal archives. "There was one more witness," he said softly. "The palace physician recorded her statement before she passed away many years later." Lucas carefully unfolded the fragile page. The faded handwriting described a desperate night inside the palace when trusted servants feared that enemies within the court had discovered the newborn heir's location. To preserve the child's life, a loyal midwife secretly carried the infant away before dawn and entrusted him to a young woman who had just given birth herself. The physician ended her testimony with one final sentence. The child's true mother never abandoned him. She believed until her final breath that he had not survived. Lucas slowly closed his eyes. The words felt heavier than any royal decree he had ever signed. Across the garden, Eleanor knelt beside rows of lavender, humming the familiar lullaby while carefully gathering blossoms into a woven basket. She had no idea that every note carried another piece of the truth he now held in his hands. Later that afternoon, Eleanor suggested they walk to a quiet hillside overlooking the valley where wildflowers bloomed beneath the autumn sun. The peaceful landscape stretched for miles, interrupted only by the winding river reflecting the clear blue sky. They sat together beneath an old maple tree without speaking for several minutes. Finally, Eleanor smiled gently. "You have carried something on your heart ever since yesterday." Lucas looked toward the distant mountains before answering honestly. "Have you ever wondered whether life can return something we believed was gone forever?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Every day," she admitted. "Not because I expected miracles, but because love never truly stops waiting." Her answer settled deeply within him. He reached into his pocket and removed the silver pendant she had allowed him to examine more closely. Sunlight caught the ancient engraving, revealing tiny details almost invisible before. Along the inner edge of the crescent moon appeared delicate initials worn by time, but still readable. E.H. Eleanor Hayes looked at the pendant with surprise. "I never noticed those letters." Lucas quietly asked, "Were those your initials before you married?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, they have always been." At that exact moment, another forgotten memory stirred inside Eleanor. She suddenly remembered an elderly midwife pressing the pendant into her hands while whispering through tears, "Keep this hidden until the truth finds its way back to you." The memory vanished almost immediately, leaving Eleanor staring silently into the distance. She placed one trembling hand against her heart, unable to explain why tears suddenly filled her eyes. Lucas watched her with growing certainty. The past was no longer hidden inside forgotten records alone. It had begun awakening within the only person who had unknowingly carried its deepest secret all these years. And he realized the moment of revealing everything was drawing closer than either of them could imagine. The morning after Eleanor Hayes remembered the mysterious midwife's words began with an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over Silver Pine Forest itself. Even the birds sang more softly, as if the wilderness sensed that something long forgotten was preparing to return. Eleanor awoke before sunrise, but found it difficult to concentrate on her familiar routine. The fragment of memory lingered in her thoughts with surprising clarity. She could almost see the gentle face of the elderly woman placing the silver pendant into her trembling hands. She could almost hear the whispered promise that the truth would someday find its way back. Yet no matter how hard she tried, everything before that moment remained hidden behind a veil she could not lift. Lucas Ashford watched her quietly from the cottage porch, while holding the weathered leather folder Captain Nathaniel Brooks had delivered the previous evening. He knew the surviving records pointed toward an extraordinary conclusion, but one important piece was still missing. He needed proof that could never be questioned by the Royal Council or by Eleanor herself. Nathaniel stepped forward and respectfully handed Lucas another carefully wrapped package recovered from the oldest chamber beneath the palace archives. This was discovered inside a sealed cedar chest that no one had opened in more than 30 years, he explained softly. Lucas slowly untied the faded ribbon surrounding the bundle. Inside rested a beautifully preserved journal written in elegant handwriting. The first page carried the royal seal of Queen Isabella Ashford, Lucas's adoptive mother. As he carefully turned each page, he discovered private reflections never intended for public eyes. The Queen described the heartbreaking decision made during the darkest night in palace history, explaining that loyal servants had feared enemies hidden within the court would target the newborn heir before sunrise. She wrote of a courageous young mother who had unknowingly become part of a desperate plan to protect the future of the kingdom. The final pages contained something even more remarkable. Folded between them rested a tiny lock of golden baby hair tied with pale blue ribbon beside a handwritten note that read, "When the child is old enough to understand, may these memories lead him back to the woman whose love first welcomed him into this world." Lucas gently closed the journal, feeling the weight of generations resting within his hands. Meanwhile, Eleanor entered the attic searching for old blankets before winter arrived. As she moved an aging wooden trunk away from the wall, she noticed something she had never seen before. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a narrow compartment containing a faded linen envelope. Her name appeared across the front in handwriting she did not recognize. With careful hands, she opened the fragile letter. Inside was a brief message written by the same elderly midwife whose face had begun returning through her memories. "Forgive me for the silence I was forced to keep. Your son lived. One day he will return when the kingdom no longer needs secrets more than truth." Eleanor's hands began trembling as tears quietly slipped down her face. She read the letter again, unable to believe the words before her eyes. Downstairs, Lucas sensed something had changed even before she slowly descended the attic stairs carrying the faded envelope against her heart. Their eyes met across the quiet room. Neither spoke immediately because both understood that the search for forgotten history had quietly become something far more personal. Without realizing it, each of them now held half of the same extraordinary truth, and the final answer, separating a grateful stranger from the mother who had unknowingly saved her own son, was closer than ever before. The quiet cottage remained wrapped in silence long after Eleanor Hayes finished reading the faded letter. She held the fragile paper against her heart as though afraid it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Every sentence echoed through her mind with overwhelming clarity. Her son had lived. The words she had longed to hear for more than 30 years had finally found her, yet they arrived carrying questions far greater than answers. Lucas Ashford watched her with quiet compassion, recognizing the mixture of hope and disbelief reflected in her tear-filled eyes. He stepped closer without speaking, allowing the silence to become a place of comfort rather than uncertainty. After several long moments, Eleanor slowly handed him the letter. Lucas carefully read every line, comparing its elegant handwriting with the surviving testimony inside the royal records. The names matched. The dates matched. Even the description of the silver pendant agreed perfectly with Queen Isabella's private journal. Every independent piece of evidence now pointed toward the same extraordinary truth. Nathaniel Brooks quietly removed another document from the leather folder. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "this is the final record recovered from the palace physician's sealed archive." Lucas unfolded the aged parchment with steady hands. It contained a birth register signed by the royal physician, the midwife, and 2 palace witnesses. Beside the official record appeared a handwritten note added years later. "The child entrusted to Eleanor Hayes bears a crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left shoulder." Lucas slowly lowered the page. Without a word, he removed his traveling cloak. Hidden just behind his left shoulder rested the small crescent-shaped birthmark that had puzzled palace physicians since his earliest childhood. Eleanor stared silently at the familiar shape before instinctively raising one trembling hand toward it. Tears blurred her vision as another forgotten memory suddenly returned with startling clarity. She remembered holding a newborn against her chest beneath the warm glow of candlelight. She remembered kissing the tiny birthmark before whispering a promise that she would always protect him. The memory flooded back so vividly that she covered her mouth to hold back a sob. Lucas gently took her hand before she could pull it away. His own voice trembled for the first time in years. "I have searched my entire life for answers I never knew I was missing." Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing not the confident traveler she had welcomed into her home, but the little boy whose face she had imagined every day since believing she had lost him forever. She whispered through tears, "You survived." Lucas nodded slowly. "Because someone loved me enough to let me go before danger could reach me." Eleanor closed her eyes as decades of grief quietly transformed into gratitude. She no longer felt anger toward the people who had hidden the truth. She understood the impossible choice they had faced. They had not stolen her son out of cruelty. They had protected him with the only path they believed remained. Nathaniel respectfully stepped back, allowing the two of them a private moment untouched by royal duty or ancient history. Outside the cottage, the evening sun settled behind silver pine forest, bathing the valley in warm shades of gold. A gentle breeze carried the familiar lullaby through the open window, and for the first time Lucas recognized every note not as a distant dream, but as the first song he had ever heard. Standing before the woman who had unknowingly saved his life twice, once as a newborn and once again as a stranger in the forest, he finally understood that the journey leading him home had begun long before either of them realized they had been searching for one another. The following sunrise painted silver pine forest in soft shades of gold, but nothing inside Eleanor Hayes's quiet cottage remained the same. The truth had finally been spoken, yet neither Eleanor nor Lucas Ashford felt the need to fill the morning with countless words. Some moments were simply too meaningful for hurried conversation. Eleanor quietly prepared breakfast just as she had every morning for decades, placing fresh bread, warm herbal tea, and homemade berry preserves upon the small wooden table. Lucas watched her gentle movements with a peaceful smile, realizing that this ordinary scene had become the extraordinary memory he would treasure for the rest of his life. For the first time since childhood, he no longer felt the quiet emptiness that had followed him through every royal ceremony, every council meeting, and every victory achieved in service of the kingdom. Across the table sat the woman whose kindness had shaped him before he had even learned to speak. After breakfast, Eleanor carefully unfolded the faded baby blanket she had preserved all those years and gently placed it across Lucas's hands. "I stitched every thread while waiting for you," she whispered. Lucas slowly ran his fingers across the tiny silver wolves embroidered into the fabric, recognizing the same pattern that had appeared in fragments of his earliest dreams. He looked toward Eleanor with quiet emotion. "I always believed those dreams belonged to another life." Eleanor smiled through tears. "They belong to your first home." Nathaniel Brooks respectfully waited outside, allowing them privacy until Lucas finally stepped onto the cottage porch. The captain bowed his head before speaking. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council has requested your immediate return. The kingdom has awaited your safe arrival." Lucas looked back toward the open doorway where Eleanor stood watching the morning sunlight fill the little cottage. "I will return," he answered calmly, "but I will not return alone." Nathaniel followed his gaze and immediately understood. He lowered his head once more with genuine respect. "Then the kingdom shall welcome her with the honor she has always deserved." Eleanor quietly approached them, her expression thoughtful rather than overwhelmed. "Lucas," she said gently, "I have lived a peaceful life here for many years. I do not know how to live inside a palace." Lucas smiled warmly. "I am not asking you to become someone different. The palace does not need another queen. It simply needs my mother." Those words settled softly between them, carrying a truth far more powerful than any royal title. Eleanor reached out and gently held his hand just as she had done when comforting frightened children from the village over countless years. "Then I will come," she answered. "Not for the palace, and not for the crown, but because I have already lost too many years with my son." As preparations quietly began for the journey to the capital, neighbors from the surrounding village gathered outside the cottage after hearing that Eleanor would soon be leaving. One by one, they thanked her for years of kindness, bringing fresh flowers, handmade quilts, baskets of bread, and heartfelt embraces. Lucas stood silently among them, deeply moved by the love she had earned without wealth, authority, or recognition. Watching the villagers say farewell, he finally understood the greatest lesson his mother had unknowingly taught him. Respect could be commanded by a throne, but love could only be earned through a lifetime of compassion. As their carriage slowly rolled away from the little cottage beside the mountain stream, Eleanor looked back only once before turning toward the road ahead. The home that had protected one of the kingdom's greatest secrets slowly disappeared behind the towering pines, while ahead, beyond the distant hills, waited a future where neither mother nor son would ever have to search for one another again. By late afternoon, the towering walls of the royal capital rose above the distant hills, glowing beneath the warm autumn sun, as Eleanor Hayes quietly gazed through the carriage window. She had imagined the palace countless times during lonely nights when memories of her lost child refused to fade, yet nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming feeling that filled her heart as the massive gates slowly opened before them. Lucas Ashford noticed the mixture of wonder and uncertainty in her eyes and offered a reassuring smile. "You do not have to remember everything today," he said gently. "Simply allow yourself to be welcomed home." Eleanor nodded softly, grateful that he understood the weight of every step she was about to take. Instead of arranging a grand parade through the city, Lucas had instructed the palace to prepare only a quiet reception attended by those who had protected the kingdom's greatest secret or helped uncover the truth. As the carriage entered the palace courtyard, Captain Nathaniel Brooks, Theodore Whitmore, senior advisors, and the elderly archivists who had preserved the forgotten records stood waiting with respectful silence rather than formal celebration. No one rushed forward. No one demanded speeches. They simply bowed with sincere gratitude toward the woman whose courage and love had unknowingly preserved the future of the kingdom. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the kindness shown to her. She had spent most of her life believing she was an ordinary woman from a small forest cottage, yet these strangers welcomed her with genuine respect instead of distant ceremony. Lucas escorted her through the great entrance hall, where sunlight poured through magnificent stained glass windows, scattering brilliant colors across the polished marble floor. Every corridor stirred faint echoes inside Eleanor's memory. She could not explain why certain doorways felt familiar or why the scent of cedar lingering in the air reminded her of forgotten lullabies, but her heart recognized what her mind still struggled to understand. Theodore quietly guided them toward the Hall of Heritage, where carefully preserved portraits of past rulers lined the walls. At the center of the chamber stood a beautifully restored cradle protected beneath crystal glass. Delicate silver wolves decorated its carved wooden frame, identical to those embroidered upon the baby blanket Eleanor had stitched decades earlier. She slowly approached until her trembling fingertips rested against the edge of the display. Another memory gently returned. Candlelight. Soft laughter. A newborn wrapped safely in warm linen. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I remember this room." Lucas stood beside her in respectful silence, allowing the memories to unfold naturally. A few moments later, the royal council gathered inside the adjoining chamber. Every surviving document, journal, witness statement, and family heirloom had been carefully arranged upon a long oak table. Theodore presented each piece with patient clarity while Nathaniel confirmed the chain of preservation for every record. Questions were asked thoughtfully, and every answer was supported by evidence that matched perfectly across decades of history. By the time the final document had been examined, no uncertainty remained within the chamber. The eldest council member slowly rose to his feet before looking toward Eleanor with gentle admiration. "For many years we believed our kingdom had survived because of wise rulers," he said quietly. "Today we understand it also survived because of the courage of one loving mother." Every member of the council stood together in silent respect. Lucas looked toward Eleanor, no longer seeing only the woman who had rescued a stranger in the forest, but the mother whose compassion had shaped his life before destiny separated them. As the evening bells echoed across the capital, he realized that the greatest homecoming in the history of the kingdom had begun not with royal ceremony, but with a simple act of kindness offered to someone believed to be nothing more than a weary traveler. The next morning, the great hall welcomed representatives from every corner of the kingdom, yet the atmosphere felt remarkably peaceful rather than ceremonial. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, covering the marble floor with brilliant patterns of gold, crimson, and sapphire, while church bells echoed softly across the capital. Lucas Ashford stood beside Eleanor Hayes before the assembled royal council, village leaders, scholars, physicians, and families who had served the crown for generations. Unlike previous royal gatherings, there were no elaborate speeches prepared in advance and no grand displays of power. Lucas wanted the truth to speak for itself. Theodore Whitmore carefully presented the final collection of journals, witness testimonies, preserved heirlooms, and royal records that had guided everyone to this extraordinary day. Every document confirmed the same remarkable story. Every signature matched. Every date aligned. Every memory that had slowly returned to Eleanor now rested beside written history with complete certainty. When Theodore finished, the hall remained silent for several respectful moments before the eldest council member stepped forward carrying the ancient silver pendant that had quietly connected mother and son across decades of separation. He gently placed it into Eleanor's hands and smiled. "Some treasures protect kingdoms," he said softly. "Others protect families until the right moment arrives." Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the pendant before looking across the hall at the many unfamiliar faces welcoming her with kindness instead of expectation. She took a slow breath before speaking. "I never imagined that the greatest gift life could return to me would not be a palace or a title. It would simply be another chance to know my son." Her words filled the chamber with quiet emotion. Lucas stepped beside her and addressed the gathering with the calm confidence that had earned the respect of the entire kingdom. Everything I have accomplished as your Alpha King was built upon lessons of honor, compassion, and service. Today I understand that those values did not begin inside these palace walls. They began with the woman who first loved me before I was old enough to remember her. The hall answered with warm applause that carried gratitude rather than celebration. After the formal gathering concluded, Lucas invited Eleanor to walk with him through the palace gardens where autumn flowers bloomed beside peaceful fountains and ancient oak trees. They spoke not as ruler and honored guest, but as mother and son quietly discovering the ordinary conversations they had missed through so many years apart. Eleanor asked about his childhood, the teachers who had guided him, and the friends who had stood beside him. Lucas listened eagerly as she shared stories about the tiny forest cottage, the herb garden, the changing seasons beside Silver Pine Stream, and the lullaby she had continued singing every evening despite believing no child would ever hear it again. As the afternoon sunlight softened across the gardens, Eleanor stopped beside a stone bench overlooking the valley beyond the palace walls. "I do not need to live surrounded by luxury," she said gently. "If it is possible, I would like to keep my little cottage and continue helping the people who have always been my family." Lucas smiled with unmistakable pride. "That is exactly why this kingdom needs you. Not because you belong inside the palace every day, but because you remind all of us what truly matters." Together, they watched families laughing in the city below while the bells rang once more across the kingdom. At that moment, everyone present understood that the greatest victory had never been finding a lost heir or solving an ancient mystery. It had been restoring a family whose love had quietly endured every season of separation until truth finally guided them home. Several months passed, and the story that had begun with a quiet act of kindness in Silver Pine Forest gradually became one of the most cherished memories in the history of the kingdom. Yet life did not transform into endless ceremonies or extravagant celebrations. Instead, it settled into something far more meaningful. Eleanor Hayes divided her time between the royal palace and the little forest cottage that had been her home for so many years. She refused to abandon the people who had stood beside her during the loneliest chapters of her life, and Lucas Ashford never asked her to. Every few weeks the royal carriage quietly traveled the familiar mountain road, carrying the Alpha King away from council meetings and official duties so he could spend peaceful afternoons helping his mother gather herbs beside Silver Pine Stream, repair old fences, or simply enjoy homemade bread while listening to stories he should have heard as a child. Those simple moments became more precious to him than the grandest royal banquets. Across the kingdom, people noticed subtle changes in their king. Lucas listened more patiently during council discussions, visited distant villages more often, and insisted that every royal decision begin with a single question: how will this help ordinary families? The advisors soon realized that the answer always reflected the lessons Eleanor had quietly lived every day without ever expecting recognition. Theodore Whitmore later recorded that no royal reform had begun inside the council chamber. They had begun inside a small woodland cottage where compassion had always mattered more than power. Eleanor never accepted elaborate titles, insisting that everyone continue calling her by her own name. Whenever visitors thanked her for preserving the future of the kingdom, she answered with the same gentle smile she had worn long before anyone knew the truth. "I only helped someone who needed kindness." She believed that if people waited to learn another person's importance before choosing compassion, they had already misunderstood the meaning of kindness. Her words spread quietly from village to village until they became part of the kingdom's character. One peaceful autumn evening, Lucas and Eleanor stood together on the palace balcony overlooking the capital as thousands of lanterns glowed warmly below. Families laughed together in crowded streets. Children chased one another across the town square, and church bells carried their familiar melody through the cool evening air. Lucas rested his hands upon the ancient stone railing before turning toward his mother with a grateful smile. "For years I believed I had everything a king could need," he said softly. "Then one unexpected journey through the forest showed me the one thing I had been missing all along." Eleanor gently reached for his hand, just as she had done countless times since they found one another again. "Life has a remarkable way of returning what love never stops waiting for," she whispered. They stood together in peaceful silence while the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the distant mountains. The kingdom had gained more than a reunited royal family. It had rediscovered the quiet truth that greatness is never measured by crowns, castles, or titles. It is measured by the compassion we choose to show strangers, because sometimes the person whose life we change forever is already part of our own story. And as the evening breeze carried Eleanor's familiar lullaby across the palace gardens one final time, Lucas finally understood that destiny had not begun the day he became Alpha King. It had begun the moment a mother's love refused to disappear, patiently waiting through every passing season until it finally guided her son all the way home.